A sad scene at the burial in the dusk of the evening by S.C. Turnbo. The dividing ridge between the breaks of the lower Turkey Creek on the north and the McVeigh Hollow on Cedar Creek on the south is known as the Chain Link Mountains. The summit of these hills, in places, is narrow with sides steep and rough. As one passes along the crest of these hills, low gaps and high mound-like formations are seen. These chain-link hills are timbered with black oak, post oak, blackjack, interspersed with the glades and bald points. At one spot, the gap in the chain is quite low, with a scattering of post oak trees and numerous flat rocks which show just above the surface of the ground. As we stand in this gap and face southward, we have a view of a small valley of Cedar Creek which empties into Big Creek. Beyond this is the distant hills south of the White River. Now, to the right is a high hill covered with timber which is part of the chain links. To the left is a small spot of rough prairie which extends up to the timber that grows on another hill similar to the shape of the one just referred to. To the north, a short distance, stands the noted Turkey Bald Knob. Further on is the hills of Turkey Creek and the Little North Fork. There is a hollow that runs into Turkey Creek that was known to the early settlers as White River Hollow, which took its name from the trail that was made by the settlers in early times in passing to the settlements on Little North Fork to the White River, and from the latter stream to the former watercourse. The trail leads up this hollow and over the gap and down Cedar Creek to Big Creek and down this stream to the river. In the early days, the settlers used this pathway so frequently that it was kept beat out, but at present date it is little but used, and is almost obliterated with the time and lack of travel. At the present days there is a wagon way from Duggansville to Luty which leads up the slope of the hill a quarter-mile west of this gap. Duggansville is on Cedar Creek 1 mile south of here. The gap we refer to is in Ozark County, Missouri. Now let us go south of the White River in Marion County, Arkansas. In a hollow that leads to Trimble Creek, at the Bill Trimble place is a spring of water that runs out of the ground at the base of the hill near the Charlie Hodge place. This water is on the road leading from Peel to the mouth of Trimble Creek. This spring took its name from Allen Trimble, who gave it the name of Mountain Spring, and was a great resort for the men in war days, now sets in our war story. In the month of May, 1863, a number of Southern men assembled at this spring to go raid into Ozark County. The leader was Bill Kane, who lived on Jimmy's Creek, and I am told that there were 30 men who were armed and equipped sufficiently to put up a good fight with an enemy of equal numbers. They were all mounted, and when they were ready for the start, they marched to the river and forded it, and after passing Big Creek, they struck through the rough hills and went to Pond Fork, and across the ridge to North Fork, and up the stream to the mouth of Little Creek. A company of mounted Federal troops were temporarily stationed on Beaver Creek in Douglas County. These men were in the charge of Captain Bill Pyland, and with Lieutenant Bill Evans as second in command. It only took a few hours for the Union soldiers to get word of the approach of the Confederates, and Pyland hurried off with his men, which were 26 in number, to find out what the Southern fellows were up to. After the Southerners had rode around a while on Little Creek, they decided to go back to the White River and traveled most of the night. On reaching the ford of the Little North Fork, just above the mouth of Pond Fork, they halted to rest before the break of day. After resting a while, they resumed the march and traveled down the creek to the mouth of Turkey Creek and turned and went up this stream to Mud Spring. By this time the sun was an hour or more high. The morning was clear with heavy dew, and after leaving Turkey Creek, they followed the trail that leads up White River Hollow to the gap of the chain links that we mentioned at the beginning of this account. By this time, the Confederates were tired and their horses were jaded and hungry, and they halted in the low gap to rest in the shade of the trees and let their horses graze. The officer in charge was careless and negligent and failed to post vignettes to be on the lookout for the enemy. They were not expecting the enemy to overhaul them and would rest a while and travel on at their leisure. But they all paid dearly for their idleness. The men turned their horses loose to fill themselves on the luxuriant growth of grass, and they scattered in every direction. Part of the men lay down on the grass, the others rested at the foot of the trees. One man read a newspaper that fell into their hands while on the little North Fork, and some of the men were giving eager attention to their reading. They were loose and disciplined, or they would have been vigilant and watchful to the highest degree for the approach of the Federals. They made a sad mistake in not doing this. In the meantime, the company of Union cavalry hurried to meet the Southern fellows, and they reached Little Creek. And when they reached Little Creek, they found they were gone back toward the White River by disappearing down North Fork, and they made haste to pursue them. By some means, the Union men learned that the Southern men had halted on the creek to camp late in the night, and they laid a trap for the unsuspecting Southerners, but they never caught them. When the Federals had reached the mouth of Turkey Creek, it was sunrise, and the trail of the Confederates were easily followed up Turkey Creek and up the White River Hollow on the account of the heavy dew and the tracks the horses made. The officers in command of the squad of the Federals were cautious and kept 2 men in advance of them, and when these 2 men approached in sight of the gap, they heard the Southern men laughing and talking. Carefully and cautiously, they went a little closer, where they got out a glancing view of their position and condition without being observed. It was a grand moment to make a dash and charge, and the 2 vedettes turned and went back to their command and made their report. Captain Pylan ordered his men to dismount, and after making a detail of 2 or 3 men to look after the horses, he advanced with the remainder of his men in a slow and cautious manner up the hollow a short distance. Then leaving the trail and turned to the left and went on until they reached the glade in view of the Confederates and halted and fired on them. We have said that the Southern men were very negligent in their duty, and we will have to say now that the Federals were certainly wild with excitement. I am told that they fired 100 shots, more or less, from their guns and pistols without killing or wounding a man, while the Confederates were in the gap. With the exception of a hole shot in the top of Harv Yoakum's hat, not a man was touched. When the volley was fired by the soldiers in blue, it was a surprise to these in gray. The noise of the outburst of the small arms and the whistling of the bullets that struck the rocks and the ground near the men created a panic, and en route they left their guns and made a wild rush for safety. A few of the Confederates made for their horses and succeeded in mounting them and went off in a wild race over the rough, stony ground. I am told that John Copeland darted for his horse and got astride of him while the animal was trotting and galloping away under the heavy fire, but not a ball touched him. This shows that the Federals were poor marksmen, as the Southern force were slack in being slipped up on. As the Southern men scattered in their exciting rush to escape, the Federals did likewise in pursuing them. Asa Yoakum ran down the hill to the head of Cedar Creek, pursued by the second officer in command of the Federals. When Mr. Yoakum had run 250 yards, his strength was exhausted, and he stopped under a post oak tree to surrender and handed the officer his pistol breech foremost, which the man took and raised it, pointed the muzzle of the pistol at Yoakum's head, and shot him just over the left eye. I am told that Mr. Yoakum struggled in agony of death a half hour or more before his final moments come. The Federals captured 19 head of horses with their equipment and a number of guns and pistols. They also captured 5 prisoners, the names of which were Jim Friend, son of Peter Friend; John Carroll, son of Tom Carroll; Mike Yoakum, son of Mike Yoakum and brother of Asa Yoakum; Bob Mitchell and Jerry Davis. The last named died in a northern prison. Now, Asa Yoakum had a number of friends among the Federals, and when they found that he was killed, they regretted it. I was told by a Southern man that it was them at the time, and while they were coming down the North Fork below the mouth of the Little Creek, they stopped at the residence of Sam and Joe Pylan. Joe was sick and was at home on furlough in bed. Some of the Southern men threatened to kill them both, but Asa Yoakum interfered and begged for their lives, and they were not hurt. As usual in war, when a man is killed by the enemy, his body is left where it falls. So it was with Mr. Yoakum's case. The body was left lying in the grass in the shade of the post oak tree. Here he gave up his life. But some of the men were kind enough to tie a handkerchief to a limb of the post oak tree that hung over the body to direct the family or other friends to where the body lay. The Southern men did not know Mr. Yoakum was killed, and when the Confederates who were running to the top of their speed heard the report of the pistol, they knew it was Yoakum's, but they supposed he had shot a Federal. But when the most of the retreating men had reached the river, and their old friend had not made his appearance, they were convinced that he was killed. On the following day, after the Southerners were attacked, Harv Yoakum, brother of Asa Yoakum, Bob Davis, John Copeland, Thomas Copeland returned to the scene of the attack and made a search for him, and Harv Yoakum discovered the dead body of his brother lying under the boughs of the post oak tree as mentioned. Yoakum and Thomas Copeland remained with the body, and Bob Davis and John Copeland went back to the Asa Yoakum farm to notify Asa's wife and children where the body was discovered, and Mrs. Yoakum dispatched a messenger with a blanket to put over the remains to shield them from the flies as much as possible. Mrs. Eliza Yoakum, the bereaved woman, in the company of Mrs. Nancy Yoakum, widow of Bill Yoakum, Tyne Copeland, wife of John Copeland, and Winnie Copeland, wife of Thomas Copeland, and Jim Copeland, son of Thomas Copeland, and Lindy Friend, daughter of Peter Friend, and Patton Bevins, started with a cart drawn by a yoke of cattle which were guided by Jim Copeland to bring the body of her dead husband home. It was a trying time. This awful war brought death and destruction in every direction where its influence reached, and the poor women and children underwent sore trials, tearful eyes, and despairing hearts. But it was war, and they were forced to abide by its results. Mr. Yoakum was shot near 9 o'clock in the morning. His body was found near 24 hours after his death, and by the time they arrived on the scene of death with the ox cart, it was in an advanced state of decomposition and very difficult to handle. They had taken the body down Cedar Creek to its mouth, then down to Big Creek to the river, where they crossed it at the Pole Clark Ford and arrived at home with the body at sunset. They were unable to take off his bloody clothes or put better ones on, or even take off his boots, but were compelled to bury the remains as they were brought home. The grave had been dug and a rough coffin had been prepared. The scene of the burial at the dusk of the evening, as the dead man's wife and children and other friends, as they collected around the coffin to pay their last respects to the dead here on earth, was wearied, tearful, and piteous. The body received interment in the cemetery near the dead man's residence. One beautiful day in September, as I stood in the low gap where the encounter took place between the two war parties, I thought of the dark shadow that enveloped the hills and the valleys of Ozark County at that time, and I thanked God that the days of blood and death of civil war is gone, And God grant it that it may be gone forever, and that the ties of friendship and love between people of both sections of our great United States may grow closer together as time passes on.